Okay, let's finish up this pretty lengthy discussion about the civil rights movement in the next few minutes. And we stopped talking yesterday with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as yet another important marker in the civil rights movement. It was a culmination, really, of all the demonstrations ever since the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955-56. It came after, of course, the gates were opened by the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas Supreme Court decision. No equal protection of the law, that's unconstitutional, and it changed the landscape. Now, with the passage of this law that came on the heels of this debacle, really, in Birmingham, Alabama, in which the whole nation sat in front of its TV sets and watched kids being attacked by German shepherds and fire hoses, the power of the government swung into action now to right this wrong, and this civil rights law, a very extensive civil rights law, was passed. And it was historic by wiping out almost all legal segregation that had been established by the separate but equal doctrine that we've talked so much about, the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And the last real legal barrier to complete civil rights was the continued inability of African Americans to register to vote in the Jim Crow South. And we've talked about all of those workarounds, the poll tax, the literacy test, the grandfather clause, just plain intimidation, all those things. And so the natural next step was to push for those voting rights. And in fact, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference almost immediately began to try to register people to vote. And this is something that had been perking, like everything else had been perking for a while. President Kennedy had asked for a constitutional amendment to do away with the poll tax in 1962. Time went on, things happened. Kennedy himself was assassinated, and in 1964 the thing had made its way through, not only being passed and put out there for the states to ratify, but finally in 1964 was ratified as the 24th Amendment. And the poll tax was banned in all federal elections, but it's not a complete measure. First of all, it didn't apply to state elections, say for governor or dog catcher or mayor or county sheriff or whatever it might be. But also, as we know, the poll tax wasn't the only way to suppress the vote. So there was more to be done. And in fact, almost immediately, African American leaders mobilized the Southern Christian Leadership Conference members and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to go out and try to register people to vote. And as you can see in the upper left-hand picture, you have both white and black volunteers of young students going out and trying to register African Americans. And the same sort of backlash that we've been talking about for a couple days now comes out of that. There are bombings of churches and other headquarters. There are people being beaten up and people being killed. And usually without any sort of justice to be had. In one case, in one rally, Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot and killed by a state trooper while he was body shielding his mother from being shot. Did this go, it went unpunished, it went on really anything. It was just something in the line of duty. And seeming pretty obvious injustice. The voting rights march in Alabama became the focal point of this thing. And they were going to march from Selma, which was sort of a poster child city for blacks not having the right to vote, majority of the population and 5% of the voting population. And they were going to then march from this town to the state capital of Montgomery, some 50 miles away, and call attention to this, and then confront the governor of Alabama, who was still George Washington, the man who said segregation now and segregation forever. And they were going to, try to change things. And when they started out to march on Sunday morning in March of 1965, they got waylaid crossing a bridge out of town, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and there was complete violence. And again, they retreated. The marchers were ordered to disperse. While they were kneeling in prayer, they were beaten with nightsticks, and it was literally a bloody mess, hence the name. And a second march was scheduled, but a judge issued a restraining order. And the violence spilled over. One of the supporters of the march was a northerner from Boston, minister, Reverend James Reeb. You can see him up in the top, not African American. And he was attacked and beaten and sent to the hospital. And the hospital wouldn't treat him because he's an agitator, and he died. Again, these kind of things. Was there going to be another march scheduled? About this point in time, President Johnson became infuriated that with all the progress that seemingly had been made the previous year and all the triumph of signing the civil rights law, we're having this kind of violence go on again, continuing. And he goes to Congress and says, we now, besides we need a companion law, we need a Voting Rights Act as well as a Civil Rights Act, a federal law. And weeks later, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Federal examiners went to register people, not volunteers. Literacy tests and other things were thrown out. And within 6 months, 250,000 African Americans had registered to vote. A big triumph. You can see the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as 100 years later, actually about 90 years later, add-ons to the 14th and the 15th Amendment. One clarifies that citizenship rights will be enforced, and the other clarifies that the voting rights of the 15th Amendment will be enforced, and the 19th Amendment, I should also add. These laws, a huge triumph, major historical events, are also a turning point in that they, between them, address almost all of the de jure, by law, means of segregation. And now it is de facto. Things that are in actual fact happening, whether there's any law to mandate them happening that way or not, such as segregated schools, as the political cartoon shows. It says conjoined twins. We have the Jim Crow segregated schools of the South, with kind of an evil look on his face, and joined at the hip is the segregated by residential patterns city schools of New York City. Are they the same thing? They're kind of the same thing. Are they? They're at least joined in many ways, and so this is going to be a little bit tougher nut to crack because we're not just trying to change a law, which is a hard thing to do, but we're trying to change behavior patterns without there being a law there to be the thing that we can knock down to try to do that. Economic issues, residential issues, just casual prejudice issues are what make up de facto discrimination, and they're more subtle. By the mid-1960s, 2/3 of African Americans are not sharecroppers in the South anymore. They live in northern cities. And so now the civil rights movement kind of gravitates naturally out of the South, where the de jure laws have been defeated now, and to try to address issues that may have effect in Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And these demonstrations now began to lead to violent confrontations. What about Martin Luther King's peaceful protests, civil disobedience? Well, we'll get to that in a second. But there are people in the North that are a bit more confrontational than the people had been in the South. And that doesn't mean that the people in the South were kinder or gentler necessarily. It's different circumstances. Major race riots in Los Angeles, and then over the course of the late 1960s, Detroit, Cleveland, Newark, various places. 156 cities in 1967 alone had some sort of racial confrontation. Why? Well, the passage of the laws that we've just talked about was what everybody had clamored for. This is what we need. They were passed. It didn't necessarily change anything in Cleveland, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Detroit, Michigan, any of those cities I mentioned, Newark. So if we've moved heaven and earth to do this and nothing's changed, then we still have to do more. And the passage of the laws made everyone who was in favor of civil rights more assertive. What we are asking for isn't against the law. The law is now on our side. And there were new and different kinds of leaders emerging who had a different viewpoint than Martin Luther King or James Farmer of the Congress of Racial Equality and some of those leaders we talked about earlier on. In trying to figure out what's going on here, President Johnson appointed a commission to look into this, and they looked into it for months and months. They were chaired by a congressman from Illinois, Otto Kerner, sometimes called the Kerner Commission, and they identified two things. One is that racism and discrimination were rampant in the North as well as the South, just without the framework of the Jim Crow laws, so that you're looking at the same mindset without those particular laws to try to bat down. And secondly, urban poverty caused much of the issues, caused much of the lack of opportunity and mobility for African Americans. And the poverty was not necessarily lack of willingness to work, but lacking opportunity to do work that would be the kind that would pull you out of poverty. So there were different issues to confront, and as I said, one of the issues is that the law's on our side. Much of the later 60s was more confrontational, if that is possible, than having police dogs attack you, but much more confrontational in both directions than it had been earlier. One of the leaders of the so-called Black Power movement was a man by the name of Stokely Carmichael, and he articulated it fairly well. He said, the most important colors we're dealing with here are not black and white, it's green. And if we could try to remember Booker T. Washington back in the 1880s and 90s talking about accommodation with segregation, because what we seek is a chance to make a living, make money, get financial independence, and we can worry about our rights in the greater society once we have economic stability and independence. Stokely Carmichael's not saying the same thing, but he's making the same point. This is a money thing. If we have enough money to go anywhere, do anything, fulfill any job, have the ability to do those things, have those opportunities, then these other things will recede as important. So they wanted to have African Americans own the corner convenience store, not somebody from out of town. They were very prideful. They were very confrontational. They were very in your face. And I would say probably rightfully so. It was the time not to be apologetic about wanting rights, but demanding. At least that's how they saw it. There was a whole movement against the so-called slave names, and there's a certain amount to it. And a person who's not in this show at all, but you may have heard of, is heavyweight boxer and philosopher by the name of Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali changed his name to Muhammad Ali from Cassius Clay. The slave owner that owned Muhammad Ali's ancestors was a Louisville, Kentucky slave owner by the name of Cassius Clay. And many African Americans' surname, such as they got it either in slave times or after slave times, was a surname of the owner of the plantation where they had lived and worked as slaves. And there was a whole generation of African Americans who shed those names in the 60s. Malcolm X being one of them. Malcolm Little became Malcolm X, became a member of the Black Panther, or excuse me, I'm sorry, not the Black Panther, I might get ahead of myself, the Black Muslim movement while he was in prison. And he was a person that thought that black self-sufficiency and black taking care of your own business and black people not standing down was important. Now, he had a break with the Nation of Islam, the black Muslims, and he was shot and killed and died in 1965. But he became a symbol of black power and of this sort of prideful independence. And we demand our rights. We're not asking for rights, we're demanding our rights. And that kind of permeated the later 1960s. Probably the best example was the Black Panthers. I said I was getting ahead of myself. The Black Panthers came along a year or two later and originated in Oakland, and as you can see, were sort of a military-like, a paramilitary group that was going to defend the neighborhood and was going to stick up for black rights with force as necessary. Seen as revolutionaries, very, very scary to mainstream America that African Americans would be putting on uniforms and arming themselves as a rebellious minority seeking their rights. They had a 10-point program for African American empowerment, black control of social and political services in the community. No Revolutionary War came about because of this. But the militancy of their feelings gave the civil rights movement a different tone. Martin Luther King was still, though, the unifying force of the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. And he still stood for peaceful protest, marching, sit-ins, civil disobedience, breaking the laws by doing things that are legal to be done, just not you doing them, let's say. And so it was that in 1968, in the spring of 1968, he went to Memphis, Tennessee to support a strike for higher pay by the garbage truck drivers of Memphis called the Poor People's Campaign. And this was a little groundbreaking in that it was specifically called the Poor People's Campaign because the garbage drivers were not all African Americans. The garbage workers included whites and blacks alike. And this was to represent not just the civil rights of the African American garbage workers, but all garbage workers. Now, the majority of these workers were African Americans, but the idea was that this is something having to do beyond race. It has to do with class and political and economic lack of clout. Well, it didn't much matter because when he got there, he made a couple appearances. He made a really eloquent speech at a black church. And then the next day, as he's out on the veranda, the balcony of his motel room to get some fresh air, he's shot and killed. From a man from another building with a rifle and a scope who shoots across and kills him. This is such a spontaneous click of the cameras, because Martin Luther King was obviously a much photographed person. It almost looks like a staged thing, and it isn't. There's Martin Luther King dead at this point seconds later on the balcony floor, and the gentlemen that were with him, standing there talking just minutes before, are pointing because they see the guy that has shot King on the roof of a building running away. He's getting away, and he does get away briefly. James Earl Ray was the man's name, and he was captured. He was tried. He was convicted. Went to prison, and 30 years later, he died in prison without having got out. Well, this ends the era in a very slam the door kind of a way, although a symbolic way. It's kind of fitting that the National Civil Rights Museum is in the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. It's a monument and a repository of things, objects about the civil rights movement that from the earliest times right up until that moment in April of 1968. Why is it such a turning point? One man. Well, King was the sort of person who obviously they could have a new president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They did. Reverend Ralph Abernathy was a leader of the civil rights movement from many years ago. There's Abernathy on the left and King on the right, probably 10 years earlier. And Congress could pass laws delineating civil rights as they had been doing, and civil rights protests could go on, and there were leaders of those protests. But the unifying person, the unifying force of the tone and quality of the civil rights movement for the past 12 years was gone. And without that unifying larger-than-life figure, there was no central leadership. Not that there ever was. It was not that Martin Luther King was giving orders to people. He was the best example of leading by example, and he was a leader because people followed. King's assassination also seemed to confirm that those people that are more confrontational were right. You kneel and pray when you're being arrested, and you allow yourself to be attacked by a dog and you turn the other cheek, and you end up with somebody, a sniper, shooting you and killing you. It's best to be up front and be confrontational, seemed to be the message. And in fact, a lot of people did believe that. Now, that's not what most leaders of the civil rights movement believed then, and it's not what they believe now, but it did put an edge on things, pretty much. Okay, further gains are going to go on. They're going to be much more sporadic. There's going to be continued backlash that isn't quite as directly violent as these, but still has elements of violence in it. And the dramatic gains of the King era paved the way for all that followed, but there's still, if you ask anybody involved in the civil rights movement from those days, they'll say that we've come a long way, but we still have a ways to go. And I think that probably sums it up better